I don't think there's been a better open world game in the last few years than Sucker Punch's Ghost of Tsushima. The beautiful visuals, intriguing diversions, and engaging combat kept me hooked for the majority of my 80 hours with the game. But like every other open world game I've played, there was one element that didn't hit me the way I hoped it would. The story. For the most part, I really enjoy open world games. I enjoy the laundry list of things to do and the satisfaction I get from checking things off one by one. I enjoy upgrading my character with new skills and gear in order to become the hero I meant to be, or whatever. I enjoy those moments of getting completely and entirely sidetracked, only to discover something that feels unique to my playthrough. However, with all of that, I have just learned to accept that open world stories aren't good. And I don't necessarily mean that they're poorly written, although they often are. I really just mean that open world games are not structured to tell compelling stories. At least, not the ones most of them try to tell. When Breath of the Wild released in 2017, it was met with universal praise from fans and critics alike, mostly for creating the ideal open world to explore and interact with. It wasn't long though before fans began dreaming about a potential sequel with the same feeling of exploration and freedom, but with the addition of the more traditional storytelling we've come to expect from the series. The problem with this is that it was the lack of traditional chronological storytelling that made it possible for the developers to create such a wonderful world to explore in the first place. In prioritizing gameplay so heavily, they had to find a story that would fit the way players would approach the game. Eiji Aonuma spoke about this.
ゼルダってやっぱり遊びがあって初めてそのストーリーが決まっていくみたいな部分があって、で今回はその広大なオープンワールドでその自由に動けてしまうわけで、そうするとまあ時系列でこう進むようなストーリーってじゃあどこからこうアプローチされるかわからないっていうところでね、なかなか難しい問題があったわけですけど。
Of course, this isn't the only way to design a good open world game. God of War is a good example of what happens when you combine many of the traditional open world elements like optional quests, loot, and the freedom to go anywhere with a linear storyline. Some make the case for this being in the open world genre, but the game's director, Cory Barlog, calls it a wide linear game. And while I'm not sure that's going to catch on, it is a more accurate way to describe Santa Monica's award-winning game. God of War highly encourages the player to follow a linear path and experience the story in a set order. The world is most certainly not open, but God of War does share the DNA of most modern open world games, so I think it has a place in this discussion as the least open world game. And in the middle of these two games, we find the subject of this video, Ghost of Tsushima. Playing through Ghost of Tsushima, I was consistently impressed by both the writing and the performances. The characters' motivations are all clear, and they always act in alignment with their motivations throughout the game. I found myself most invested in the conflict for the main character, Jin. At the start of the game, you find Jin in the midst of a Mongol invasion, and after a brief introduction and tutorial, you wake up as a now wounded Jin, living in a Mongol overrun island. Your uncle, Lord Shimura, has been taken prisoner by the Mongols, and you have to figure out how to save him. Being raised as a samurai, there is an honor code that you've always been expected to follow.
しかし我らは規律を守ることで民の模範にならねばならん。
The game establishes that you've seen morality as black and white, with no room for nuance. But now, you must do whatever you can to survive on your own and take back the island. Jin struggles with this decision and the disappointment that he expects to see from his uncle. I think the writers were successful in the way they represented both sides of this conflict. At first showing that Jin would see his people killed and his uncle rotting away in captivity if he were to stick to the old way of doing things, making his non-traditional methods of killing and terrorizing Mongols seem worth it, but then eventually showing the consequences of his dishonorable actions. There are no winners in war. You might be thinking right now that I've actually made the story sound pretty good, But of course, the issue isn't the ideas it explores, it is how they are presented, and more specifically, how they are paced. Pacing is one of the most important elements of a well-told story, and the design of open-world games make pacing almost impossible. Because of pacing issues, I think the story of Ghost of Tsushima would be better told in almost any other medium. Ghost of Tsushima uses multiple characters and side stories to help flesh out the main story, and I really like that, but every time I found myself getting into one of these tales, the chapter would end and I'd be left in this open world with all the momentum of that character's story lost. I would need to ride my horse back to the starting point of the next chapter, or use fast travel and sit looking at a loading screen. Several times during my playthrough, I ended a chapter of one of the side stories only to find out that I wasn't able to continue that thread until I made some more progress with the main story. I understand why this is necessary, but sometimes I didn't get back to those interrupted stories for hours. The main story is also plagued by these frequent starts and stops, which constantly led to me trying to remember what was actually going on. This just isn't a good way to tell the story that Ghost of Tsushima is trying to tell. As games have become more mainstream, they've adopted a lot from the film industry, and one of my favorite examples of a well-paced story in film is The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. Watching the film as a kid, I remember being disappointed when the story would cut away from Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli to Sam and Frodo, but I would quickly move past that disappointment because my attention was immediately on another interesting plotline. Ghost of Tsushima attempts to do this, but ultimately fails because of the design of the game. Because it's an open-world game, the player is encouraged to weave their own narrative by combining the main story quests with side quests and other random activities in the world. This can be a plus for the moment-to-moment gameplay, but this freedom ultimately hurts the main story the game wants to deliver. Ghost of Tsushima attempts to weave multiple narratives together, but they just can't quite connect the same way the Two Towers does, because there's too much left up to the player. And I think that's a problem because the freedom of open-world games is often the major selling point. I do want to take the time to say I don't expect to pick up the next AAA open-world game and experience Tolkien-level storytelling. It's just that it's disappointing to see all these well-made story pieces wasted on game structures that can't fully highlight them. I'd love to see an open-world game with a story that is best experienced through the gameplay of an open world. But as of right now, I just can't see how that comes together. And hey, maybe all I'm really doing is highlighting how my unrealistic expectations with open world stories is hurting my experience with these games. But because video games are my preferred medium for experiencing story, I'd like to think there's a solution for this shortcoming in one of the industry's most popular genres. And maybe the simplest solution is to do what Nintendo did with Breath of the Wild, and leave the story as somewhat of an afterthought. Because if the open world is the main attraction of a game, the story should really only act as a way to enhance the player's experience with that world, instead of adding restrictions to it. I think what I'm realizing is that when it comes to open world stories, less is more.